Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Aaron Dorr. On behalf of members of the Missouri Firearms Coalition, you've had about an hour and 35 minutes on this bill, so I'm going to be blessedly brief for all of you today. As you've already heard, this bill simply restates what SAPA was when it passed in 2021, removing key sections the court found problematic in the Eighth Circuit. The Senate version you have in your hands right now, it's 14 pages long, but only 2 pages have actual new language on that in this packet, with the exception of the enactment clause on page 7. So what we're doing here is restating SAPA, taking out the problems the court had with the law. Section 1.420 was one problem that's been removed from this. The word infringement has been removed from this, and the requirement for the courts to defend has been removed from this as well. Everything else you see here is cut and paste language, although restructured, renumbered from 2021, with the addition of some new language on page 4 and 5. Happy to discuss. I'm not sure it's worth the time right now, but happy to do that. As far as some of the concerns that were raised, to your point, Representative Veet, the confusion perhaps on the penalties is found from the fact that we're talking about 2 separate issues on page 5. This is, again, the Senate committee substitute. That's what I've got in my hands. I apologize for not. It's a different layout than the House language. On page 5, at the top of the page, that's where you have an injured person who has been injured by this code section. That's where the person who, for example, local law enforcement violated SAPA, came into their home, took away their AR-15. That is an injured person who can then file a civil suit for $50,000 per violation. So that's the standing, and that's the amount of damages. Going down in that page to 1.471, this deals with the concern that we've had in the past, where law enforcement can basically, jump jurisdictions, where one day they're a sheriff's deputy, the next day they work for a federal task force. So in that description, in that problem, that's defined, and that's penalized in that section 1.471, and the penalty is spelled out in the top of page 6. That's $50,000 per employee hired by the jurisdiction who knowingly violated SAPA law under the color of federal law enforcement. So it's 2 situations. One is a personal violation if their rights were violated. One is if the department willfully hired somebody who they knew had already violated SAPA law, albeit under a federal badge. I hope that provides some clarity. I want to address the issue about why now relative to the Supreme Court. I texted the AG a few minutes ago. SCOTUS has not agreed to hear this case. So far, what SCOTUS has required is a response from the DOJ to the AG's appeal for a cert petition. So we do not know right now if we're ever going to have our day in court over SAPA or not. That's kind of a secondary issue. The issue about aid in the feds has been addressed quite a bit. I want to address this a little bit more, just very briefly. This is on page 7 on the Senate version. And again, there is a complete carve-out for allowing Missouri law enforcement to aid the feds, even if firearms are involved in cases that involve felony persons crimes or felony distribution of narcotics. So the only thing that Missouri law enforcement cannot help the feds with is the enforcement of federal gun control laws, which of course is the purpose of this bill. Last question, the one you raised was, can Missouri take federal dollars? Does this preclude that? And on page 4 of this bill, the bottom of section 1.451 says nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit Missouri from accepting federal dollars or officials and dollars to enforce Missouri laws. And that's the point. We want to have Missouri cops enforcing Missouri laws, and this bill makes it clear Missouri can still get federal aid just to enforce Missouri gun laws. So with that, I'm going to stop and answer any questions. I hope that gives some clarity to the bill.
Thank you. I just want to, I don't know that answered the question from Representative Veet, because I think the language does have, I'm seeing what you're seeing, Representative, in the, because it says a civil, even in the section we're talking about that moves on to the per employee, the civil penalty of $50,000 per employee, and then it goes on to say any person residing in the jurisdiction can bring that action. I think for the, I think we've talked about this to death. I think there's just some information that's lacking. As Representative Hardwick had brought up, that how the courts have been handling this, either through some res judicata mechanism, who's brought it first. I don't know if I'm unfamiliar with any of these actions that have been brought, but I think that would be helpful for the committee to have going forward from someone. But the way I read it is absent some type of court mechanism, I don't think it's unclear. I think it actually says that any person could bring it, which means if you're in a town of 20,000 people, do 20,000 people have standing to bring this laws? I would say yes. Now, whether there's a limiting factor on a race to the courthouse, who brings it first, and then I think there's a discussion on whether that's the best policy to have going forward. But I do think there's some information lacking just to kind of cut that off at the pass on that, because I read it and have that same question. But are there any other questions from this committee? Representative Myers.
And so in the case when we talk about what goes down through the beginning of the law in 420, and then when we get into hiring people, so if somebody say they get tired of being a federal law enforcement agent and they decided that I want to come work in Missouri and work for a sheriff's department,
Right.
And that sheriff's department would be prohibited what would normally be a good candidate to add to their workforce just because they had worked for the federal government at one point or time or another. There's no room in there for grace for you if somebody walked away from the federal law enforcement side and wanted to work in the state or local level.
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer to the question is that I think it's a little broader than that. If you look on page 5 of the Senate language, it talks about the prohibition on hiring former federal. Is that my mic? I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. The prohibition applies only if the person previously enforced or attempted to enforce these unconstitutional federal gun control laws. So that's on subsection 1 and subsection 2 in the bottom of page 5. So it is not a blanket ban on hiring former federal law enforcement. It only engages after this law would take effect and only if federal officers violated SAPA law. And just to answer the next potential question, we don't want people like that enforcing Missouri laws, because if they're willing to enforce what could be an unconstitutional federal gun control law, there's a concern that might happen again. And so that's the only reason why. But again, it only engages if they have enforced federal gun control laws after this law takes effect.
I would push back on that, but I know several folks that have gone to federal agencies and regret their choices and want to come back to work here, but they were enforcing federal gun law while they were working either for the FBI or the ATF. So them coming back, leaving that behind, because they didn't necessarily like the work, didn't necessarily like how their supervision was having them act on certain cases, to come back and work at a state level, they couldn't do that anymore. They'd be prohibited from that. Thank you.
Further questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
We'll